Hello, I'm Omar Moore, film critic, and I am here for the next 90 minutes, talk about Compliance. This is an unofficial audio commentary for Craig Zobel's excellent film. And as you see there, inspired by true events. And look how large that fills the screen. That's such a huge title there. And I don't think it could have been done any other way, really, when you think about it, because you really do have to almost hit the audience over the head with the idea that what you see in this film really did happen. Happened in 2004, actually at a McDonald's in Mount Washington, Kentucky. And it's a story that still is unbelievable, even as you watch the events in Craig's film here. Ann Dowd, as you see here, plays Sandra. She's the manager of the fictional edition of the McDonald's restaurant. It's the Chick Witch, and she already faces a major problem on this day. Her refrigerator door was left open, and the food inside it spoiled, so there was a lot of damage. And Matt Savito here, who plays the food services delivery man, is now chastising her about what has happened, and in a very demeaning way. So we see already gender right at the top of this film plays a very key role, the gender dynamic, and that will be repeated throughout the film. This is the introduction of Becky, the character played by Dreamer Walker, and Becky is an employee at the Chick Witch. Here we see Pat Healy. Now, Pat Healy is a fine actor in his own right. He plays, well, we'll find out who he plays. I think you know who he plays, but a lot of people who've seen this film forget that we actually get a glimpse of Pat Healy early on in the film, and of course he plays Officer Daniels. So we've already got a quick sense of who that person is. At least we know it's Pat Healy playing this role, but we don't know what he's going to be bringing, but we will shortly. And here these shots of the interior of the restaurant, and what Craig does so well here is give us a real picture of the artifacts of the restaurant, but we don't really see a wide shot of the restaurant. In fact, we never see a full shot of the restaurant, and it's all about keeping things very close to the bone, close to the vest, in the way that we as an audience get exposed to things as if we are right there inside the restaurant. So that's the purpose of the great cinematography by Adam Stone, to keep everything very tight and very claustrophobic. And here we see that Sandra is giving a pep talk or a meeting to her employees, some of whom really tune her out here, and some of whom just don't take it very seriously. And we see that smiling face we just saw of that young man, Philip Ettinger, and he plays Kevin. And Kevin and Becky are good friends, and they really don't take anything Sandra has to say seriously. And we see this kind of, now this generational gulf between Sandra, who's probably in her mid to late 50s, and probably somebody who grew up under a patriarchal household and had probably worked at Chick Witch maybe for 20, 30 years, started out where Becky and Kevin are now, and now has become the manager of the restaurant, probably the manager for maybe 10 years now or so. So she's now at the prime of her career as a manager, and you can see that the employees, some of whom, again, just don't really take her seriously, particularly Kevin and Becky. Marty on the left there is played by Ashley Atkinson, and she's the deputy to Sandra. She's wearing the navy blue outfit there, and she and Becky here are having this conversation about the boys that Becky has sending her these topless photos of themselves on her phone. And this is a very interesting prelude here that Craig has, because there's this kind of psychosexual aspect to this dialogue. And of course, Hitchcock did a lot of that in his work. And here comes Sandra again. and she hears this conversation, interrupts it, and kind of tries to make herself relevant here. You know, she's not even been proposed to yet, but she believes soon that she will be. And look at this tension here between the two of them, between Sandra and Becky, the way Sandra kind of looks at Becky and Becky kind of gives her this almost sarcastic congratulations. Look at that. Look at that flicker of kind of Sandra's kind of assessing the information about the topless men who are sending Becky these pictures. And look at Becky here. Becky is played by Dreamer Walker. Dreamer Walker's excellent here. Look at, she's laughing, and nobody says that anymore, sexting. And here, this is, I guess, one of the first indications that there not only is tension, but there's also this kind of sense of being rebuffed and left out, and kind of this sense of surveillance that pervades this film, voyeurism, that pervades compliance. And as Marty and Becky are talking about, nobody says sexting anymore. They think, I think, that Sandra's not there, and she's actually right behind them looking at them. And it's actually a creepy moment, kind of disturbing expression on the face of Sandra there. Now, Sandra has just been talking to Harold. Harold is played by Stephen Payne, and Harold is the janitor of the Chick Witch. He has ended his shift, and he will make an appearance, of course, later on in a very key scene in the film. That is Nakia Mathis, a brief shot of the African-American cashier. I'll talk about her a little bit later on as well. Nakia Mathis does some good work here, really fine work, and talk about more about the characters as we go along here. Now, Compliance has some roots in films that Craig Zobel was inspired by. The Lifeboat, Alfred Hitchcock's film in the 1940s, I believe it was 1944 or 1946, somewhere around there, where spatial relationships were very key. And we're going to talk about that a bit more here. Look at this introduction of Bill Camp. He, in the first shot we see of him, is well back at a huge distance back in the shot outside. And Bill Camp is the actor who plays Van, and Van is the man who supposedly is the fiancé. He's not yet proposed to Sandra here. And you see this introduction to their relationship, and it's one fraught with tension. It is one fraught with a lot of kind of anxiety, and Sandra clearly wears the pants in their relationship. But we can see from the shot that we just saw of Van instantly standing outside that the relationship between the two of them isn't as cozy as I think Sandra would like us to believe that it is. Here's Nakia Mathis. She plays this cashier, and she's upset about what happens with the way she's being treated. It's really funny. She makes the character really vivid and alive, and I really enjoyed the few scenes that she has. She does have a very key scene later on, and it speaks to who the character is so well, and also the way black people look at the police, or at least many black people, particularly black people who live in the cities of this country in America, how many of the African American population, especially the younger population in particular, looks at police and views the police, view them with, of course, a great deal of skepticism and suspicion. based, of course, upon a lot of the police brutality and outright murder that has happened against black people who, in the highest majority of those cases, just mind their own business and haven't done anything to break the law in a lot of these cases. Look at the way the camera here is moving as Sandra now has received this phone call. And again, look at the artifacts, the touching of her tie there. And the camera is not fixed anymore, which suggests that there is all of a sudden a shift in the mental equilibrium of this particular character, but also a shift in the equilibrium of the film itself. The camera that Adam Stone operates is just kind of bobbing up and down, percolating. The frame is unsteady, and it's very clear that something is going on here. This phone caller, the voice is that of a man, and we don't know who it is. Or we know that he says his name is Officer Daniels, and that is Pat Healy's character, but we haven't yet got a sense of what he wants. He's apparently accused Becky of stealing from a customer, and we haven't seen that happen in the film. Certainly, we're going to know in a few moments that Becky is going to protest her innocence here. And they're now in the back room of the Chick Witch. Notice again, we don't get to see the whole room in one shot. We only see parts of the room, and again, that's by design to keep everything very close and claustrophobic. And even as you saw Becky walk into the room, there are these bars and these shelves, and it suggests almost a police precinct and a jail, like a holding cell. Of course, it's not a jail. Of course, they're in a back room, but those bars, even though that they are horizontal bars and not vertical ones, it reinforces this idea now that Becky has now stepped into a completely different environment within the place that she works. And this is where the film's terrain begins to become, slowly but surely, a lot rougher. Again, the spatial relationship, and I was talking about Lifeboat and Hitchcock's film there, and that was about a group of people who have a lot of tension between them, and one of the people had been accused, I think, of doing something very bad to a number of people on the boat. I believe either it was a thief or somebody like that was trying to do something, and now they all get caught on this boat in these very serious circumstances that force them together, and they're trying to stay alive on this small boat. So there's all this tension between this group of people, and that was one of the films that Craig was inspired by, and also there are other ones too. The one, I believe, in the 1960s as well, where, and I forget the name of it, starred Martin Sheen, and it took place, the entire film, inside of one car of a New York City subway train where people were being held hostage, and I don't remember the name of the movie, so I'm sorry about that, but Martin Sheen was in it. And it, again, talked about space, talked about limited space and what happens between human beings when they're put in these situations of a lot of duress and stress and very tight claustrophobic spaces. A more recent film, 2010 movie actually, called Buried, which starred Ryan Reynolds, emphasizes this as well. In fact, it's one film with one character, and the only person on screen the entire time being Ryan Reynolds, who is an Iraq contractor, or rather he is an American who does contract work in Iraq and gets stuck in this coffin all of a sudden, and he's trying to get out and trying to get help, and all of a sudden he realizes that his only ally is a cell phone, I guess a penknife, and a light, and he has to use all of those things to try to keep himself alive during the course of this movie, which was directed by Rodrigo Cortés. And there's another film about, back in 2002, I believe, called Phone Booth. It was directed by Joel Schumacher. That film also emphasized this idea of, at least in this particular instance of this particular film, a phone voice controlling the entire proceedings, which we have here in Compliance, where there's a phone voice, Pat Healy's voice, who is really directing all of this from afar. And in Phone Booth, Colin Farrell plays a man who has to follow all the commands that the phone voice of Kiefer Sutherland gives him to follow. And he has to do that or risk being killed. Forrest Whitaker plays police chief, I believe, or police detective in New York, who tries to get to the bottom of all this. And that film has some very interesting threads to it. There's a shot there you quickly saw briefly there, a brief shot of the audience, I should say the patrons at the Chickwich, and the part of the place where the Chickwich employees make the food, and that's the only shot that we see where we see both of those types of environments right on top of each other. And that's the only shot in the entire film where we see this kind of window to what's going on in this restaurant. It's obviously a very busy Friday, and the employees are busy working. They are under duress. There's a shopper, a mystery shopper that's supposed to come in. There's this accusation that's happened, that's being made against Becky. Plus, of course, the food is spoiled, and the bacon has spoiled, almost $1,500 worth of damage. So it was all these stressful things that have happened. And many people will look at this shot here, and the audience, I think, kind of looks at this moment in the film and thinks, well, why doesn't Sandra just hang up the phone? Well, it's not necessarily as easy as that. I think we all think that we just hang up. But when you're under stress like this, under duress, it may not be so easy, and authority plays a huge role. If he called up and said that he was a Hallmark card deliverer or deliverer of flowers or something, or that he was the president of the United States, I think Sandra would have hung up. But it's strange enough, the president has a lot of power, much more power than a police officer does. But in terms of immediate power, a police officer has so much more of that immediate power than the president does in terms of what he can do to affect something immediately. The president doesn't walk around with a badge and a gun. A police officer does. And so even though we don't see the police officer, and Sandra doesn't, obviously, Sandra feels a real responsibility to do the right thing when she hears that the voice on the phone claims to be a police officer. Of course, we know he's not. But I think the reason, other than the duress and stress, that Sandra does not hang up the phone is also her upbringing. She's brought up in the 1950s, I think. I think she's probably, again, in her late 50s or so. She's been brought up, maybe in the early 60s, whatever. She comes from a different age. She has been brought up, I think, in a patriarchal society. She's been brought to trust the police, to listen to police officers, always obey them, tell the truth to them, trust them. And I don't think that people in Becky's generation, as we see Dreamer Walker here doing an excellent job as she listens to Pat Healy's voice, and she kind of soaks all this information in. Look at the camera there. This subtle movement of the camera down to Becky, which suggests this unequal power, this unevenness, and this kind of power dynamic, which now, again, not only reinforced by gender, but reinforced by generations. So we've got the situation now where Becky is no longer anywhere near the kind of jolly person she was, say, 5 or 6 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago. Now we see something very uncomfortable unwinding, and the way the camera juxtaposes a seated Becky with a standing Sandra is quite powerful, I think, and it's also very subtle too. But you see the space dynamic again here. There's very little space between them, and I want to just go back and say, Becky, probably if Becky had picked up that call, and anyone in Becky's generation, certainly Connie, played by Nakia Mathis, the African-American character we saw earlier, I think if either of them had picked up the phone and heard that someone on the phone was telling them that they were a police officer and that they wanted to investigate a theft at the restaurant, I bet you anything that both of them would have hung up the phone immediately and gone back to work. I think that the same would have been true of Kevin, played by Philip Ettinger, the young man that we see, one of the fast food workers that we saw earlier, who's Becky's friend. I think that he too, had he received that phone call, would have hung up the phone immediately. Yet what I think is also interesting is that when Becky and Kevin get the phone handed to them, that neither of them hang up. In fact, nobody hangs up the phone in this film until a point that is far, far too late. And here again, the camera, look at the movement. The camera slowly moves. I love this, the cinematography that Adam Stone does. I think it's really, really good. And it just does some very powerful but subtle things to give us this idea that there's an imbalance. And as the camera bobs up and down like this so slowly, I get this vision of the scales of justice and injustice. And of course, anybody who knows about that, you see scales on courthouses, and often it's a woman, a lady who is blindfolded holding these scales, meaning that she's not judging. And one scale obviously is higher than the other one. And here I get the view that Officer Daniels is holding the scales in his hand. He's a master manipulator and a very cruel human being, and a very vile one. And I picture him holding the scales. One of the scales, in one of those scales sits Becky, and in the other scale sits Sandra. And Sandra has all the power here. And it is the puppeteer, the perverted puppeteer, Officer Daniels, who's holding these scales. And in a sense, he's blindfolded because he doesn't see them. He's on a telephone, so he doesn't see who they look like. He describes them, and I'm sure he probably did a little bit of research. He describes what Becky looks like, but he's never seen Becky before, I suspect, and he's certainly never seen Sandra before. So he's blindfolded to them, and they to him. They don't see him, they only hear his voice. And that is exactly the image I get when I look at this scene, that this untethered voice is blindfolded, obviously, we don't see the person, and he's holding these scales in his hand, and you see the scales being represented by the camera movement that Adam Stone has. As I said, the scales are being imbalanced. They're balancing right now. You know, Becky sits in one, and in the other scale sits Sandra, and there's now a different relationship between Becky and Sandra in that moment. It's now changed from tension now to fear, and wondering what's going to happen next. Becky is really concerned, obviously, about her well-being at this point. She's now been accused of something she didn't do, which is a classic, another Hitchcock refrain too, from his film The Wrong Man in 1956, which interestingly enough was also based on a true story. And it was a true story of a man, a musician, a very popular musician, I believe, who played at the Supper Club in New York years ago. And he was wrongly accused of several crimes that he didn't commit, and was jailed and convicted of all of those things. And it wasn't until some work was done to free him, but it took a big cost on his life and on his family life, the life of his wife. The toll it took on both of them was just really devastating. So The Wrong Man, which was a great film starring Henry Fonda playing the musician in that film, is also a film that I can't help but reference as I watch Compliance. And you just saw that shot of Becky and that white light that kind of eclipses her. There's this moment where she is at a crossroads emotionally and psychologically, as this voice on the phone prods her to just be truthful and tell the truth, nothing will happen to you. And of course, what Officer Daniels is doing is using these police interrogation tactics of good cop and bad cop. Just, is everything's okay, don't worry, tell the truth, or you'll be able to go home. So there's this coercive nature to what he's doing as well. You know, Becky's a young teenager. She's probably 17, 18 years old, 19 years old, and she's thrown into this thing. And perhaps for her, you know, it's a very terrifying moment for her, for anybody. But perhaps she thinks that by just getting out of this, the only way to do so is just to kind of comply with the officer's wishes. And she thinks that he's a police officer, but she knows she didn't do anything wrong. Sandra is being told that she's doing a good job, and this is part of the film that I think, you know, reminds me so much of the Stanley Milgram experiments. Dr. Stanley Milgram was a professor or a doctor at Yale. In 1961, he did these experiments that ran for, I think, a couple of days, I believe, a day or two, where he would invite people to pretend to be shocked. They're actors who would come in, would pretend to be shocked by an electric shock that other participants who didn't know that they were administering fake electric shocks would do. Because when the actors got questions asked of them and they answered them incorrectly, these other people who were invited in on the experiment would turn a dial that would raise the voltage and give the actors who got the questions wrong, the answers wrong, an electric shock. They thought, the people who were giving these shocks, that they were real. But of course they weren't real. And even though the people giving the shocks had problems with what they were doing, when Dr. Milgram told them, it's okay, you're doing a great job, keep going, they would continue to shock these people, the actors, despite their reservations. And in fact, there was the experiment just, you know, was really powerful, because they found, Dr. Milgram did, that in over 65% of the cases, the people giving the shocks continued to give them, even though they knew what they were doing was wrong, and even though they felt that what they were doing was giving actual electric shocks, something up to about 450 volts. So it was very disturbing, and it proved that when people are told by authority figures that they're doing a good job, they will continue to behave in that way, even if what they know they're doing is wrong. And it harkens back to Nazi Germany, where the defense at Nuremberg, at the Nuremberg trials, and some of these Nazis, when they were captured and put on trial, was, well, we were just following orders. And it goes back to Abu Ghraib in 2003 in Iraq. American soldiers and privates were following the orders of people up above, up on high, who were telling them to torture Iraqi prisoners. And also it goes to the abuses at Guantanamo Bay, which also go to the Stanford prison experiments that Philip Gallardo did back in 1971, where people would become absolute monsters after a while. They pretended to be prison guards, and then there were a group of people who pretended to be prisoners, and after a while the prison guards became so brutal and savage over a couple of days that they had to stop the experiments. And the experiments were supposed to go on for 2 weeks. They only went on for, I think, 3 or 4 or 5 days, and they stopped them. It just speaks to the power of authority and how we as human beings react and respond to that. Here we see Dreamer Walker as Becky undressing, and what Craig does is keeps things very tasteful and subtle. He does not linger on Dreamer's body in any way, and any shots of her body are not gratuitous. And there are people who saw this film who actually thought that Craig was being gratuitous here, and I completely disagree with those claims. I think that Craig was very tasteful in how he did this, and of course the situation that Becky's in is not tasteful at all. It's very distressing and disturbing. She has no control. She's been stripped of her autonomy and her agency. She is absolutely humiliated at this point, and we see the look there on Sandra's face. And Dowd carefully calibrates her feelings about Becky, and she has a lot of conflicted feelings about Becky. But one thing she is very clear on is that what's happening here is very painful indeed, and she feels not only discomfort, but probably an immense level of guilt. Here's the thing, and many people think that these characters are stupid, and they say, well, why don't they just hang up? But as I said earlier, there's a lot going on here. And these characters aren't stupid. We see that each of them questions some of the commands and the orders and the directives that Officer Daniels gives them. And Sandra here is asking Officer Daniels, well, why would I go to my car and put these things in there? It doesn't make sense. So on a number of levels, Sandra's not just out to lunch here. She is consciously aware and thinking about logistics and the logic of doing this. And there again, we see the shots of the bars there. They look like prison bars, except of course they are horizontal and not vertical. But it shows that Sandra is thinking, and she's not completely out to lunch here at all. She is thinking. In fact, she's not out to lunch in any sense. She is being targeted in a very stressful situation, and she is become really kind of, I guess, just kind of lulled into this here. And you hear sirens in the background as I'm recording this commentary. That is not the police that are coming to see about the situation. Officer Daniels talks about, well, the police are going to get there, they're going to come to the restaurant, and they're going to do this. Can you just do this for me until we get to you? And the thing is that Officer Daniels is never going to get to them. And anybody who's obviously watched the film, and I hope if you're listening to me that you've seen the film before you're listening to this commentary, but we know that Officer Daniels is nowhere near Ohio, and that's where this film is set. We know that Officer Daniels is in the comfort of his own home. And we know that the police precinct is barely half a mile away. And in real life, it was literally, I believe, a quarter of a mile down the road from the McDonald's in Mount Washington, Kentucky. And yet nobody called the police at all because they thought that who they had on the phone with them was a police officer. Look at this shot here. And that shot, there's so much going on in Ann Dowd's face and her eyes. I find Ann Dowd to be a superb actress here. And she's been acting for many years. She's done a lot of TV. She's done some theater work. She's been in some films. She's been in, I think of her in the film Garden State, where she played the role there. The film by Zach Braff. But Ann Dowd here, I think this is her finest work. And I love this film a great deal. I thought that this film was the best film of 2012. And that shot that we saw of Ann Dowd there as Sandra just kind of looking at that close-up shot, she's contemplating. And part of me thinks that she's satisfied with what she's doing right now. Part of me thinks that in her eyes there's a bit of revenge and kind of this secret kind of happiness deep down that she's got Becky in this very compromised position. And then another part of me thinks that she is being led, that she's under a spell. And all of that is communicated in her eyes, I think, in her face. It's just an amazing expression. And it's hard to articulate what's going on. And I think Anne is just amazing. She's amazing here. And I tell you, someone who deserves awards for sure for her performance here. And certainly we're looking at her right now. And some of that score that you hear, that's Heather McIntosh, amazing composer, the music she fits to this film is perfect. And it just lays out so well with the kind of road that Sandra's going down. And the music's not really as judgmental as a lot of music scores seem to be. And that's what I love about Heather's work here. She makes everything really, really fluid and without overreaching. And this is her first feature film score. And she has that sensibility and that intelligence and the sophistication and musical know-how from her many years doing music to know just when to step on the gas and when to take the foot off the accelerator. She does it so well here. I think Sandra is trying to recover. She's trying to gain control over a situation, but the truth is that ever since the food supply delivery guy berated her, and ever since she got rebuffed by Becky and Kevin in the meeting, and ever since this busy Friday evening, she's trying to regain her sense of foothold and her own authority. But her authority has already been undermined. Undermined not only by Becky and Kevin, but undermined by the situation now with Officer Daniels, who has now put her in an impossible pickle, so to speak, for lack of a better word. She's now lost complete control. She has authority in a way, but she doesn't have control anymore. And as an authority figure, while she's still looked at now with great fear as far as Becky's concerned, she really has no power because she has lost it. She's lost control of her restaurant. It's a very busy restaurant. Lots of customers are waiting for food, waiting to order their food. It's a very difficult situation. And she's now deciding to believe this voice on the phone. Lots of tension in this situation with the bubbling, boiling oil, and it's a cauldron of tension. And I love the way that there's this juxtaposition between food and people, and I'll go into that a bit more later on. Now here is our first, I think, beyond the opening shot of him, this is our first real look, I guess our real reintroduction, if you will, of Officer Daniels, played so well by Pat Healy here. And the music, the score from Heather, it's kind of this imbroglio that brews. And that's the back of Pat Healy's head. Pat Healy, by the way, also appeared in Craig Zobel's first feature film, Great World of Sound, and he was excellent there as a guy who thinks he's on the make as a con man who does these things, and he puts in a great performance in that film. And that was a film from 2007, Great World of Sound. Check that film out. It's a good one, very good one, and it deals with some of the similar issues that we see here in Compliance, which is Craig's second feature. Here we see that glimpse of Becky's breast, the side of her breast, and that's Kevin there, played by Philip Ettinger. And Becky covers that up now, and you can see how uncomfortable she is, and also how uncomfortable he is. This flicker here of I wouldn't say it's desire, but it's this kind of fleeting moment where it's shock. I don't think it's necessarily that he's titillated, but it's shock. And maybe there is some flicker of that in his eyes and what Kevin is feeling, what he's feeling. But the point I'm making here is that there's this surveillance, this voyeurism, this constant voyeurism that goes on throughout this film, and I'll point out other moments of it later on. But there's lots of it here, lots of shots where characters are observing other characters or observing other parts of their bodies. The camera observes parts of their bodies, and the camera observes the faces, parts of the faces. Again, this very kind of Hitchcockian way of glimpsing faces and parts of faces. In Vertigo, of course, the opening credit sequence, of course, features a woman and we only see parts of her face. We don't necessarily see her whole face and her hair, but we see her lips and her nose and one of her eyes, and it's this way of deconstructing a body, a woman in this case, deconstructing elements of the body and compartmentalizing her body and her face, and it's kind of this sensory feel, but it's very cold at the same time. It's sensual in a way, but it's cold, and in this film it's much more cold than it is sensual. There's nothing sensual about the way the camera glimpses Becky and glimpses her face and her mouth and her eyes. None of that is sensual at all here. It's shot in a very kind of blunt, stark way. And this whole film deals with surveillance, even and voyeurism, and how the Pat Healy character, Officer Daniels, as you see him there talking, later on you'll see these moments of him telling Bill Camp, who plays Van, to describe Becky and parts of Becky's body, and it's very morbid and really uncomfortable, and not morbid, but just very uncomfortable and creepy. And it's this surveillance, it's this voyeurism again, it's this constant voyeurism. And maybe there's a larger point to be made about that too. You know, the way that the United States has really changed since 9/11, 2001, and how now people are constantly searched. Cameras are all over the place, and even with the phones that we have, right? Cameras are built into every single cell phone that there is now. I don't think you can get a cell phone today that does not have a camera also attached in it or embedded in it. I don't think you can anymore. Now, 10, 15 years ago, you wouldn't have had a camera. Maybe 15 years ago in a cell phone, you wouldn't have had a camera in it. In 1995, 96, 97, whatever. In the 1990s, you wouldn't have had that for the most part. Now, everywhere. So there's this voyeurism, there's this surveillance. Instant news. We get our news a lot of the times from amateur photographers with their cell phone cameras or their video cameras who shoot things that happen. And there's a real usefulness in that, but there's also a real destruction in that too, is that there's no moment that's private anymore. And there have been documentaries about this too. I believe there was a documentary a few years ago called My Life in Public, or We Live in Public. Forgive me if I get that wrong, the title of it wrong, but that film talked a lot about that. This idea that there's no private moments anymore. And not just for celebrities, but for even ordinary citizens. There are cameras, there's millions of cameras in London. London has more cameras in it per capita than any other place in the world. London. And 20 years ago, that would have been unheard of, but London is the most surveilled and surveyed city on the planet. There are more cameras per square inch than anywhere. And here we see this shot of Sandra almost completely out of the frame, and this is, I think, the moment of reckoning. Sandra now is completely out of the picture almost, and that's symbolic. The equilibrium has changed. Look at the steadiness and security of this camera shots here with Officer Daniels, and how he's now at home relaxed, and he's watching the window, and he's making a sandwich, and he's at peace and comfort. And of course, the people here, Becky is not. Sandra is not. She's kind of going along to get along with Officer Daniels here. And look at this shot of Sandra. She is kind of currying favor here with Officer Daniels as he talks to her about her employees like Kevin and other things that she is being asked about. now this moment is a very important one in the film, and we're about 45 minutes into the film now, actually. And at this point is a big turning point, because we're now looking at a situation that's going to become a lot worse for Becky and for everybody, but Becky especially. And it happens with this key moment here where Officer Daniels plays good cop now, and he has Sandra smiling and laughing, and this is, Sandra talking about her fiance, who really isn't. She lies to Officer Daniels there and tells him, well, yeah, he's my fiance and very soon I'm going to get married. Well, he hasn't even proposed, and we learned that earlier. So she tells him a lie, and that's the only time I think in the film where Sandra actually lies to Officer Daniels. But it's kind of this oddly romantic moment, because she is being given validation for the first time in the film. Here's Officer Daniels buttering her up, and he tries to form this alliance with her, and no one has really given her any respect in the movie up until that very moment. And so she plays along with that and is ingratiated by that, and that's what interrogation techniques do. They play upon fear, but they also play upon pleasure. So there's pain and pleasure techniques that Officer Daniels uses. It comes right out of police manuals and psychological interrogation techniques. So, lo and behold, Sandra has now brought in her fiancé-to-be, I guess. And here's the great Bill Camp playing Van, a character who is an awful guy, but yet he has a lot of remorse, as you will see. And of course, all of what you see here really did happen. The real-life manager of the McDonald's actually did bring in her fiancé and asked him to come in and guard the person in real life. Here, Van is being introduced, and he comes in, and he's going to do the same thing here. And here is the second look at the relationship between Van and Sandra. And you can see again, it's circumstances that are not very warm and loving, and obviously the relationship between them doesn't seem to be very loving in this film, because for all the nice things that Sandra has said about Van, and that he knows how to get her worked up with texting and sexting and all this kind of thing, we see the opposite. We see that the truth is very different, at least as far as we see them participating in this film. We see a very kind of cold, businesslike interaction between them. Granted, it's over a very painful situation, but still, we see there's this kind of hesitancy of affection between them. They don't really have any affection. I mean, Van hasn't come in and given her a hug. He hasn't kissed her. I mean, even in a situation as painful as this with Becky, he doesn't come in and hug her. He doesn't come in and hug Sandra, I should say. He doesn't come in and give Sandra a kiss. And it's very distant. So there's a lot of tension. And I think there's not only a lot of tension in the relationship between Sandra and Van, but there's also a lot of tension in the situation within Van, because I think Van is a character who is very pliable. We see that he's been asked very early on by Sandra in the first interaction, well, try not to get too drunk. And you can see how hesitant Van is and how compliant he is even before he gets to the situation we now presently see him in. We can tell that he is a guy who doesn't necessarily think for himself. He's a guy who, although he has a heart in some way, he's a guy who needs to be led. And it's the kind of personality that he has too. He, doesn't really necessarily proactively do anything. But we're going to see what happens to a person who's put in that situation. And he is now left, and he is now being really softened up by Officer Daniels. And he's not a very bright guy, in my estimation. I don't think Van's very bright. That doesn't mean that he's not intelligent. I just don't think he's a very smart individual. Despite his questioning of some of the things that are being said to him by Officer Daniels, he doesn't take note, to assess the situation more immediately. And again, you see here the claustrophobia of this scene. Even though the scene's a slightly wider shot of the back room there, we now see that it's a different animal now. Becky is now cornered in a different part of the restaurant. I don't know if people noticed this, but this actually is a different part of the restaurant where she's being held now. So all of a sudden now, this part of the interrogation, and we don't see that she's actually been led from one place to another, but it looks clearly as if she's now in a different part of the back room of the restaurant. And we clearly see now that she is even in more duress and more pain and more trouble than she at first was in. Just the way that Sandra looked at Van just then, and Van kind of has some hesitance, but you can tell there's not a lot of warmth between Sandra and Van, and part of that is because that Sandra is going through a lot of stress. It's a very stressful day on the job. She's already told Van that she's swamped, and perhaps she's mildly irritated at Van for calling her during her work, and you can see that there's this tension between them. Sandra is kind of very tense and very agitated because of not just what's going on with Becky, but with everything else in the restaurant, and the food situation, the shortage of food, the spoiling of food. So Sandra's really completely, I think, disengaged from Van, and maybe there's a larger statement about the workplace and how that affects the way people who love each other behave with each other. I mean, if your wife or your husband had come home from a hard day of work, and you could probably say that there have been times in that relationship with your wife or your husband where you, as the other spouse, have felt a little bit of that, because there are people who bring their work home with them. There are many people who do, and there are some people that don't, that are able to just disengage that moment and just leave all the stress at work. They'll talk about their job, but they won't bring a lot of that stuff home, and they'll kind of talk to their wife or talk to their husband about their tough day. But it depends on what kind of work you're doing. If you're a doctor, it's difficult to do that in many instances. If you're a lawyer, it may be difficult to do that in some cases, depending on the kind of law you practice. If you are a food services worker, it may be a lot easier for you to disengage that process. It depends upon the work you do and the profession you're in, or the type of work you do for a living. Here's the slow-moving camera again as we gradually get this movement that comes across, and it also pervades to the shots of Pat Healy here. And this is the moment where Officer Daniels is throwing this bad cop routine. He's saying to Becky, look at where you are. Take a look at where you are. He's reinforcing this sense of claustrophobia and the idea that she is in a deeper hole than she wants to be in. And before she tries to refuse his directive, she's got to consider her position and where she is. And even Becky, she asks why. But sir, why? And she is clearly aware this is wrong, but there is a point at which she begins to acquiesce, and as she cries, you see that tear falling down her cheek there. That's the pain that she feels, and here is Officer Daniels, for lack of a better word, closing the deal. He's trying to convince Becky that if she allows Van to strip search her again, then she can go. This is no longer about the money. It's about this cruel, evil, perverted hoax, this trick, this kind of game that destroys people, that Officer Daniels is playing. It's not about the money anymore. It's about him getting his jollies off. And even though he doesn't always do that in an explicit way here, you see these flickers and these looks on his face and his eyes and his smile when he finds out about Becky's anatomy. And this is not about the money anymore. It's about this man controlling the sequence and this gender dynamic that has now really seen Becky, as the woman here, thrown into complete submission, and she again disrobes. And I wonder, had the caller been a woman claiming to be a police officer, would any of these people really be going along with this? And I dare say no. In fact, I spoke to Pat Healy about this as well. And in an email response to me, he said to me that he thought that wouldn't happen. He certainly thought that it was the man who would do these kinds of things, who would have this thing running as long as it did, and who had these evil things going on in his mind. A man would do that, but he didn't think that a woman who would do this would be able to do so, because it's just the way that men and women's brains are wired differently about these types of things. And he felt that if a woman would make that call, it certainly wouldn't go on as long, and she certainly wouldn't have probably had the designs to actually let it play out like this. And so he definitely answered no on that, and I agree with him. I don't think that a woman who even was up to this, or even tried to, would have lasted very long. I don't think she would have pushed it, and I think that they would have hung up on her immediately. And then there we go with the issue of sexism and gender, how men and women respond to a woman in charge differently than they would if a man was in charge. And we see that here. We see that the way Sandra was looked at, the way Sandra was talked to by the food services man in the beginning of the film. We see that in the way that the employees kind of react to Sandra when she gives that pep talk. They don't take her seriously for the most part. And again, it's this idea of gender and how gender plays a key role in this movie all throughout the film, and how gender gives us this real window into the way men and women behave around each other, and these stereotypes that get put forth. So I definitely think that a woman probably wouldn't have even attempted the phone call, much less been taken seriously, quite frankly. But again, this is the idea. These people never hang up when this man is on the phone telling them to do all these things. And I, again, dare say, if a woman were on the phone, it just wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have even had a movie. You just saw Pat Healy as Officer Daniels there laughing, and he's just been laughing at the fact that Van has described a part of Becky's body, her nipples, and what they look like, and and described her vaginal area and her pubic region. And he said, well, we should deputize you, Van. We should deputize you. You're doing a great job. This has got nothing to do with money. This is about sexual power play and sexual humiliation. And Van doesn't see that. He has some questions about it, but he doesn't see quite where all this is going. Becky clearly knows where it's going. But Van is still the man in the middle here, or the monkey in the middle, if you will. And he's being controlled, and he asks questions, why, but he still goes along with it. Even when Becky says to him, what? What are you asking me to do next? And the audience has been saying this throughout, and many audience members who watched this movie on the big screen walked out because it was just too much for them. It was very uncomfortable for them because nobody was stepping in here to do the right thing. And movies, we're so used to seeing that, but the audience is plunged headlong into a nightmare. And it's a nightmare of not only Officer Daniels doing, but also, quite frankly, everybody else is doing, because they all acquiesce to him. And at one point, you end up not only doing what someone tells you, but you do it also because of your own volition. Nobody makes you do anything. No one can make you do something, even if they have a gun pointed to you. Your own sense of carrying out that next step is the thing that does the trick. The gun provokes duress and fear, obviously, fear of losing your life, but it's still up to you to make that next step to, of your own volition, do something. And here, Van has now taken that step. I mean, there's no police officer in that room with him. There's no police officer standing there. He is now taking that step, and you see what he's doing there. And you see this shot here of Becky, and you may see, if you're eagle-eyed enough, you will see that as she gets off the counter, she is wearing, I think, some kind of protective underwear that's supposed to be kind of camouflaged with her body. I don't know if you saw that. It's a quick shot, but watching this on DVD, and you see it right there, it's kind of this dark beige underwear that she's got on there. So she's not completely naked in the film. Not that that matters here, because it certainly doesn't for the purposes of the movie, but for the actress, for Dreamer Walker, she is not completely exposed. Again, but that's kind of cold comfort here, because of course the character herself is very much exposed, and of course you can't separate Dreamer Walker from that. But it's a testament to her great acting and what she does with this character, psychologically as well as physically. It's more of a psychological performance and a physical portrayal too that makes the character so powerful. And we just saw there Ann Dowd giving a real talking to Becky. You know, Sandra giving a real talking to Becky there, you know, and becoming very harsh with her, becoming this bad cop. She's already a police officer. And we see now Officer Daniels running and scurrying. He's on a calling card, so he can't be traced, and he's been exposed here. He is calling on a card, and yet Van doesn't get it. What's happened? He's asking, what's happened? What's happened, Officer Daniels? And here, the shot of Ann Dowd dissected like Hitchcock's Vertigo, the eye, and the two eyes, the imbalance, and Heather's music, Heather McIntosh's music there. It's kind of this really indicting moment, I think, that indicting beat. And it's this point of no return, I think, that shot is, of Sandra, you know, the two different eyes, the two shots of her eye, her left and her right eye. You know, it's kind of like this imbalance in her now, you know. She's gone to a point of no return. And I like the shot selection that Adam Stone uses and the way that Craig puts that in the film, that insert of her eyes. You know, is this close-up of her. What's she become? What is she doing? How does she get here? It's this moment of reckoning. And it's the second moment of reckoning that we've seen with Sandra. The first one was earlier when there's a shot of her, kind of medium close-up, and she kind of pauses there, and she looks around. And then this shot of her right up close, I think it's really powerful. This indictment of what she's put into motion here, because she's really facilitated this as much. She's gone from being compliant to being an accomplice. She's gone from being compliant to being complicit. And quite frankly, so is Becky. She's at a moment now where she has gone from being this person who is being terrorized to a person who kind of now acquiesces to the terror. But it's not because she wants to, it's because she wants to survive this awful onslaught, and it's her way of escaping. It's her way of protecting herself, and any rape victim who feels compelled to will tell you that this is not something that they do because they want to do it. It is an act of self-preservation and survival. And if it means to have an out-of-body experience, to kind of pretend that they're not there or to think that they're not involved in this, I mean, they are obviously involved because they are being victimized and brutalized in such a violent way. But the idea of them having the out-of-body experience to kind of imagine that they're not really there as it's happening, this is what many rape victims talk about when they talk about an out-of-body experience that they have. It's almost as if their life leaves their body and they're looking at someone else, another version of themselves actually being physically attacked and raped. And many rape victims talk about that survival mechanism, and they do have these experiences, and it's a mechanism that gives them the power to survive such a traumatic event. And it's all about self-preservation and survival at that moment. And so that is what we're going to see here with Becky. And in these next few scenes, we're going to see that. And you will see the way Adam Stone's camera shoots her during some of these moments, very disembodied, because it represents this out-of-body experience that she's going to have very shortly here. And Van is listening. We see that Van has now become completely complicit as well here with the directives, and he even adds a couple of his own. Hey, how about we put the phone on her back? I'll put the phone on her back so you can listen. And even Officer Daniels here, he's going, wow, yeah, that's a great idea. He's all into it too, and he's, for the first time here now, he's, kind of gleeful, even more gleeful at what's going on in this sickening situation. This is an examination now of Van's own nature. Is this what he's about to do part of his own deep desire? Was it his desire? Is it his fantasy to spank a woman, a very attractive woman? Maybe that's what's also going on here. And Craig Zobel deliberately leaves this, I think, unanswered, and we are left to draw our own conclusions. And look at the insistence. Look at this bad cop. Look at this thing, and look at Becky kind of pondering it all. She submits to it. She complies. She becomes complicit too in her own demise as a victim and for survival purposes. And we see the way that Craig shoots that. And on the big screen, this is even more powerful and haunting and disgusting than it looks, I'm sure, to you on the smaller screen, but it's no less distressing. And we see what's happened here. And you look at this juxtaposition of the chicken being shaken up and delivered and baked vigorously, and the food, the juxtaposition with the food and the people consuming the food on one side of the restaurant here, with all these patrons happily munching and drinking and all of this kind of thing on one side of it. And then in a few seconds, we're going to see the cruel juxtaposition. It's kind of like Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, about the California meatpacking industry in the early 1900s. And look at this now. Within this very same place where people are eating food, fast food, is a horror story that is going on right now between Becky and Van. It's an absolute horror. And this is right on the other side of the wall from this restaurant. And it's really grotesque. It's really grotesque. And you don't look at fast food the same. Look at that cup with the straw. And that's the straw that Becky's been drinking from. That's the cup. And we see again these artifacts. The phone that Officer Daniels uses, I believe, or the phone that's been used by Van there. And then look at that sink, the dirt. It's the same place we just saw that employee shaking chicken over, the flour over. And now that's been stained and sullied by what we see here with what happened as Becky there was being raped by Van. Raped orally, but raped nonetheless. And there's more than one way to rape a human being. And Van has now just raped Becky. And Sandra assesses what's going on, and she knows that something's happened, but she doesn't know what. There's a great deal of guilt there with Van. He knows that what he's done is an evil thing. He knows he's raped Becky. He knows he's gone way too far in this sick game. and he knows he is someone who could easily be charged with rape. And in fact, in real life, the real life fiance was indeed charged with rape and was sentenced, I believe, to four years in prison. Aren't you going to kiss me goodbye? She says. And I have to admit, I found a little humor in that line. It's not a funny line, but I find it to be this kind of uncomfortable moment. Well, aren't you going to even kiss me? And it's kind of this odd moment. I don't think it's meant to be funny. I don't think Craig means it to be funny, but maybe because my own discomfort perhaps provoked that kind of laughter. That she would ask him, well, aren't you going to kiss me goodbye after all the things that, he's done here? He's raped somebody. And it's, again, this kind of psychosexual thing that's happened here in this film. She now wants this affection from him, and yet he's a brutal human being. He's a rapist. And she wants this kind of kiss. She has no clue what's just happened. And now Van's remorse here. I've done a bad thing, he says. And again, here comes the out-of-body experience. Again, this disembodying of Becky. She's only being shot now with parts of her hair and her nose there. And here again, like Vertigo, parts of her eye, her face, her nose. We don't see her full body really in any of these shots here. And here we still don't see her full body. And now we see her looking up at some surveillance video. And these banks of video are, again, another method of surveilling the restaurant and surveillance in the film, this voyeurism. She's watching all of that. And she's ultimately, again here, we don't see her in full, but we see again in the background this kind of Big Brother surveillance. It's this post-2001 situation, 9/11/2001, this voyeurism and this surveillance that constantly happens to all of us. And that's what this film is also about. Being on camera, being asked to perform. And earlier on, Officer Daniels has asked her to perform. And pretend, it's all of these people are performing. But they're performing, I think some of them are their desires. I think that Van subconsciously really wanted to do that. He was a willing participant despite his doubts. And this ties again into the Milgram experiments, where people are being told to do things by authority figures, and how authority is still a very powerful thing in our country. Here in America, it's a very authoritarian country still. Now we see the return of Harold the janitor, played by Stephen Payne, and he's been asked to continue the terror. And we see Becky now back in the other part of the interrogation area now, I guess you want to call it, in the back of the restaurant. And here's the hero of the film, I guess, qualified hero. He stands up to Officer Daniels, this Harold. I'll be damned if it isn't, he says. Did you see when Kevin said "see"? When Harold talks about it not being right, and Marty tells him to shut up, and there's this guilt-ridden look on her face when she says this. She knows that this is wrong, and yet none of them have really actively stood up and called the police. None of them have. Here's the moment of truth. She's talking to Robbie, the guy that she thought was on the other line with Officer Daniels. Robbie's been sick all day long. And look at Ann Dowd here as Sandra. And then the camera just... Look at this. I love this part here with Sandra. Look what she does here. Look at what Ann Dowd does. And look at Becky. Look at the look that Becky gives her. It's kind of this look of despising. She despises Sandra there in that moment and is angry with Sandra, but she contains it well, Dreamer Walker does. And then Ann Dowd just walks out of there, not a word to say. Really great acting from her. Here is James McCaffrey. He plays Detective Niels, a real police detective. Look at this camera shot here. And the camera was strapped to the door, if I'm not mistaken. I did have a conversation with Craig about this. Strapped to the door of the car, I think, and they tried to maneuver the camera around, and it took them a long time to get it right, and they did get it right. And I like that shot, and it's a shot that holds here. And people question this shot. They go, well, why do we have this kind of close-up on this detective for so long? I think it's about a minute or so. And we have the accompaniment of Heather McIntosh's score. But the reason I think it happens, and I think Craig has said this too in the conversation I had with him, is to give the audience a breather. We know we've just been through almost 80 minutes or so of a very intense and disturbing experience, and now here's our time to kind of unpackage it mentally. And we refocus our eyes here on someone who's completely new to the film in Detective Niels. And he, I guess, would be the guy on the white horse for this movie. Although the shot, of course, is completely at night. And that music kind of is this way of letting us down back to reality, you know. And we've just spent the last minute or so on him, and it's a way to kind of breathe. And here comes that shot again with the camera and the door, which I love, actually. And this is the epilogue to the film now. I think all of this is epilogue as James McCaffrey, who plays Detective Niels, who is now a real-life detective for the purposes of the film, real as opposed to the fake detective Officer Daniels character, comes in to try to assess things and find out and kind of re-encapsulate what's been going on and get a grip on it, because a lot of audience members still are disbelieving. And I think Detective Niels' function is to just really put everything in perspective. It reminds me of that shot in Psycho, that moment in Psycho, where the detective or the psychologist comes in at the end there to explain what we've been seeing with Norman Bates. You know, that Norman Bates has this obsession with his mother who's been dead for years or dead for a long time. And, you know, that he is a cross-dressing person. He's this transvestite, or this guy who dresses out to get these sexual thrills, you know, dresses up in his mother's clothing and everything, because he had a very close relationship with his mother, and he has these tormented things happening to him, and this is his way of dealing with that. So it's this explanation process that goes on here too in Compliance, much like Psycho, where you've got this detective kind of trying to put this together. And he asks Becky, well, why did you do this? And she said, well, sooner or later she knew she would have to. And that speaks a lot to not only gender play and Becky's background and what she said about those topless men on her cell phone, but also to the way our society has ideas about sex and the notions of what women are expected to do in sexual situations or in situations where men and women are together. And we see here Pat Healy's character, Officer Daniels, is not only not a police officer, but he is married, presumably with children, as you saw there. So it doesn't matter. He could have been anybody. And I think that part jars some audiences too. He's not just this lonely pervert. He's a guy with a family. And there are people who do this. He is an anybody and an everybody. And all these characters are us, all of them. And that's what makes the film so disturbing. Because any one of us have the capability of doing any of the things that we've seen in this film. So it's not so easy to just remove yourself and say, well, I would never do that. Well, how do you know? You know, it all depends on the situation and also who you are as a human being, how you've been raised, what signals you're sent, what you would do. Are you a follower or a leader? And you have to answer those questions, I think, honestly for yourself, and explore this film as honestly, I think, as Craig and everybody else has done, to kind of come up with some answers for yourself. And, that notion of expectation, like I just said about Becky, she said sooner or later she knew she would have to. So maybe this has happened before to her. Maybe it's, again, the environment that people expect certain things. Like many men, or some men, expect that if they pay for a date with a woman, they are expecting sex. And nobody will be offended at hearing me say that, because it's true that there are men out there who expect a sexual favor from a woman if they pay for a date or pay for whatever. And, there's a lot of men who resist that notion, by the way, including myself. There's lots of men out there who don't buy that, who don't think that if they spend money on a woman that they should expect sex from her. And certainly not on a date, and certainly not the first few dates, and certainly not perhaps for a few months. You've got to build a relationship with somebody. And this film ultimately is about relationships and about how people relate to each other in situations, and what previous histories of relationships do to those situations when those situations become very strained and stressful and a lot of duress. And here we see the unmasking of Officer Daniels. This investigator now comes to him, and he's on the phone. Isn't that something? Can you hold on a minute? Just a second, he says. Becky is in black there, and she's been in black now for the last few minutes, so there's almost this kind of rebirth, for her. She's still not all right, in that sense. She's kind of disembodied, but now she's slowly coming back into her own, and to an extent the black kind of hides the rest of her. She's kind of being remade there as she goes through with legal options with the attorney. And now here also is something that really happened on 2020. Back in 2005, John Quinones interviewed the real-life manager of the restaurant, and Craig has put that in here too. This time with Sandra sitting in the hot seat as the manager of Chickwich, and a reporter who's played by an actor here who interviews her. And I think this scene's very important to the film. I think some people, some critics have said that this scene's kind of redundant and not needed, and it's kind of a weaker part of the movie, but I don't think it's weaker at all. It's not weak at all. I think this reveals something very powerful, not only about our culture and how we kind of say things, well, how could this have happened? And this, again, this gender dynamic, right? You've got the male TV reporter talking to Sandra here about what happened. Well, how could you do this? How could you do that? It seems like he's made it pretty cut and dried. But again, here it's also about Sandra's character and the kind of person she truly is. And you will see in a few moments just how she is, how she has these qualities in her of manipulation, like we all do, and charm and flirtation. And we'll see all of that coming up here. And he's just asked her, well, were you brainwashed? And she says, yeah. Maybe not as much as Becky was, and maybe not as much. I was not as much a victim as Becky was, but I was a victim, and I believed that this guy was a police officer because he always had an answer for every single thing, and that's one of the things that people look at. If you bark a command, if you say something sternly, people will turn around and pay attention. And also, if you have an English accent, like I do, or at least some people still think I do. I mean, I still have some accent, but people respond to certain voices much more strongly than they do others. In other words, a stern male voice will get a lot more attention than a stern female voice, or a male voice in general will get more attention, and people will be more apt to listen to that. Certain accents from England, from wherever, will get more sway than, say, an American accent of some kind, or say an accent from within America, whether it's from the South or whether it's from the West. Well, there's not really a lot of accents in terms of California accents so much, but in parts of the country, some accents will get higher favor than others. And here again we see surveillance, voyeurism, surveillance, our media culture too. The surveilling the victims, and voyeurism, asking about the victims, and the lawyers just told this reporter, well, you can't answer the question, Sandra. It's that surveillance again, looking at the video. Let's go to the videotape. And here's the moment I'm talking about. Look at what Ann Dowd does here as Sandra. And there's an Irish brogue in there too, if you listen carefully. The charm. There it was, the Irish brogue. If you don't mind the heat in it. And look at that statistic. Over 70 similar incidents were reported in 30 US states. That is shocking. And it should shock you. And that's the sobering element of the film, too, that Craig's done here. This really happened. And people really need to see this film to understand that. And I think they need to see it twice, as painful as a lot of this film is to sit through. It's really necessary to understand that human beings can do these things when pushed, and when in the right or wrong type of environment or situation. That this is not something that is engineered by a bunch of stupid people. It's not about that. It's about people who are very much alive and conscious and aware, making some choices that are devastating. And we see the cast names. All of these people have done an excellent job bringing this film to light with these characters that they play, and everybody else superbly so. And Adam Stone here, and Scott Gardner's additional photography, Jane Rizzo's editing, which I hadn't even talked about. Jane Rizzo does an excellent job. Matthew Munn's production design, which is integral to this whole thing, to get the sense of space. Heather McIntosh's score, Heather doing a wonderful job there, and all of the other people who've contributed to this film. And again, we see the cast members coming up here in order of appearance, and Nakia Mathis as Connie stands out, as well as the rest of them do. It's just a really good cast, and for such a small budget film like this, that Magnolia Pictures, in their infinite wisdom, decided to go ahead and distribute here in the United States. It's a home run. It's really a home run. The film didn't cost very much money at all. It was shot, as I said, in about 3 weeks or so, and it was superbly rendered. I think it's the best film of 2010. Excuse me, make that 2012. Check that. The best film of 2012 by far, I think, because of what it does. It makes you think. It makes you discuss things. You talk about this film for days and weeks to come after that. And any film that can do that is a film worth watching at least twice. And you get your money's worth, for sure, because it doesn't provide you with an empty feeling. You are constantly thinking about it. And it's not a film you escape from, and that's the point, because these issues are very much around us today still. The TSA and their strip searching of people who get on planes. You cannot fly unless you are subjected to some kind of search, whether it's a strip search, electronically strip search, with these machines that they use now, where they can see every part of your body and everything else, or whether it's something else. So you cannot get away from this. There was a story about this where a man refused to search, and it got a lot of attention in the news here in the United States. I'm Omar Moore, and I'm glad you listened to this commentary, and I hope you think about these issues.